Hi AMP1 students. In this video we are going to start talking about articulations, which is another term that we use to refer to joints in the body. So I'm going to go to our learning objectives. And so the first one, and I'm going to make these a little bit bigger. See them a little bit more here. First thing that we're going to do is to talk about synovial joints. And this is one of those chapters where we cover part of this chapter in lab, which we'll do in a couple of weeks. And then the rest that we don't cover in lab from chapter 9, we cover in lecture. Now, we are going to be covering this information in lecture, this chapter in lecture first. So that's why I want to kind of go over some basics on a synovial joint before we start talking about different types of joints in the body. And then when you get to lab, then you'll learn a little bit more about the other types of joints in the body as well. So, the first couple of objectives is to define what a joint or an articulation is, and it's just a place where you have a connection or contact between maybe a couple of bones, 2 or 3 or 4, or maybe you have a connection between bones and cartilage, or bones and teeth. So those are all places where that we call joints or articulations. All right, the next objective is where we'll talk about a synovial joint. So in the synovial joint, there's different types of joints in the body, and then you guys will learn about the classes of joints in the body plus their characteristics. But for lecture, we're just going to focus on the synovial joints and their characteristics. Now, synovial joints are the ones in the body that are most numerous, so we have a lot more information about them that we discuss. So the characteristics of all synovial joints, kind of what makes them a synovial joint, is they are where you have bones that are connecting with each other, but they don't actually physically touch each other. There's a little space between them, and that's called a joint cavity. So if we have a synovial joint, the characteristic that makes them a synovial joint is that they actually have a joint cavity, which is this little space that separates the bones from each other. And then the other thing that's unique about our synovial joints is they are freely mobile. So these are the joints where we can actually move, and we can move in a really large range of motion, extensive range of motion. So examples of our synovial joints, which we are really familiar with, is our elbows and our shoulders, our knees, our hips, the joints that are in our wrist and ankles and fingers. Those are all kinds of joints that are considered synovial joints. So, and you can kind of move around, and you know that those joints you have like a extensive range of motion with them. You can do a lot of different movements in those areas. So we call them freely movable or mobile for that because of that characteristic. So in lab, you'll talk about some joints that don't move at all, and then joints that just kind of slightly move. So synovial joints are going to be the ones that are freely mobile, can do all kinds of things like flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, depression, elevation. So you'll talk about all those movements in lab too and learn about them. All right, so for our third objective, we want to look at the basic features of all synovial joints. So I'm going to go to our picture, because pictures usually help you to recall the information that you're going to be learning about. So they have this kind of typical synovial joint. So like I said, most of our joints in our body are synovial joints, but they all basically have the basic structures, and that's what we're going to talk about in this objective. And then the next objectives, we're going to more specifically talk about joints, synovial joints in the body, and then how they differ a little bit, like what kind of characteristics they have that are different. So like, what characteristics your temporal mandibular joint has from your, elbow joint. So we'll talk about those differences. But they all basically, if they're called a synovial joint, they do have the joint space. That makes them synovial and they're freely mobile. But they have some other structures that also you would see in any synovial joint in the body. So that's what this objective is about. So they just have a generic joint here. I kind of look at this and think it's probably one of the joints in our fingers, the way the bones look. So, but this would be like a typical joint, synovial joint in the body. So we have this, you can see this is bone, and obviously it's an adult. All we have is a epiphyseal line here. We don't have the growth plate anymore. And then we have this bone down here. So these two are the bones that are forming a connection or contacting each other. But realize that there's this space where they actually don't physically touch each other most of the time. They are separated by this little space between them. And that's the joint cavity. So we have this little joint cavity. And notice that the picture, the way they're showing this, they did like a frontal or coronal section through. So that way we can kind of see like this half, kind of look in and see this half of the joint. And so realize that, this joint would go completely surrounding, we're only seeing about half of it. So, but it helps to cut it that way so we can actually see the internal structures that we need to see and learn about. All right, so here is our articular capsule. That was the first, I'll flip back here. That is the first basic feature of all synovial joints, is each of them have an articular capsule. So we'll go back to our picture. So that is what this is representing here. So this is our articular capsule. They have it right here. So it's made up of two parts, which we'll talk about. But that is the articular capsule, kind of the outside of the synovial cavity. So they call it a articular capsule. So we have two parts. We have the fibrous part, and that part is made up of, just dense connective tissue, and it's kind of there just to make sure the bones holds the bones, in place together, make sure they don't get pulled apart. So it's mainly there for, keeping the bones in alignment. So that's the outer layer of the articular capsule. And then the synovial membrane, they kind of colored it purple here. So that's the most inner layer, and that's connective tissue too, but it's very special. It has some specialized cells in there that actually are there to produce the fluid. So this little space, the joint cavity that we said was the space, it's not actually empty. It's not just like air in there. It has fluid, so like a very viscous, it's kind of like a thickened fluid that's kind of oily. So I usually, if I was to use something to kind of help you visualize what the synovial fluid looks like, I would say whenever you crack an egg open, not the yolk part, but the rest of the egg, that sort of viscous, oily sort of substance, that's kind of what the synovial fluid looks like. So that's what's in there, and that's the little specialized cells in the synovial membrane, with the help of the blood, components in the blood, produces that synovial fluid that's gonna fill up this joint cavity here. So it'll contain that synovial fluid, but it's the synovial membrane's function. One of its functions is to produce that synovial fluid, and it does it constantly. So like the synovial fluid will be produced, and then eventually it will drain, and then we'll get more synovial fluid being produced, and then the old will drain. So it's kind of constantly being replenished, I guess is the term that you would use. So it's not like we're born with the same synovial fluid that we have when we're older. So it's constantly being replaced. Okay, so that is our fibrous layer and synovial membrane that make up the articular capsule. And I do have this information, just took it directly from the book, but just so you have like a little outline of what you need to know. So we're gonna talk about the articular cartilage, which we've talked about that before, so that's probably not going to take as long. But the articular cartilage, remember, is the cartilage that remains after a bone's formed and has grown. It always remains covering the surface of the bones where they're going to connect to another bone. So in this case, we have this, they kind of make it kind of light blue or white. This is the articular cartilage, so you can see it on the surface here, and then you can see the cut section of it too that's there. So we have this articular cartilage that's covering the ends of our bones where they're going to connect together at a joint. And so the reason there's some functions of that articular cartilage that you'll want to be familiar with. So it's different than bone, so it's very smooth and soft. So it reduces friction when we have those bones moving. So when our muscles contract and they pull on the bones and the bones move and we get movement at the joint, we're going to not have as much friction if we have articular cartilage there. So it'll reduce friction between those. So that's friction would be like rubbing. So you have like a nice slick surface because of that articular cartilage for those bones to move against each other. And then also it's kind of like a cushy sponge too, so it absorbs compression. So when we have, body weight or any sort of activities that we do, exercise, any compression it'll provide kind of like a cushion, so it'll absorb some of that compression. And then it's there, to prevent any sort of injuries to the ends of our bones too. So, and it helps, do that through reducing friction, absorbing compression, but also other things that could damage our bone in that area too. So it's there to protect or prevent damage as well. So we like to keep our articular cartilage for as long as we can, because it's going to be very important for the normal functioning of our joints. All right, so all of our joints, synovial joints, have the articular capsule and the articular cartilage and the joint cavity. And I think they talk about they talk about joint cavity, so we kind of mentioned that. That's the space that permits the separation of these bones at synovial joints. And then the synovial fluid, we talked about how it's a viscous, oily kind of substance that's produced by the cells of the synovial membrane. And then what's in the synovial fluid is like things that come from the blood, so certain components of the blood, not the red blood cells, so it's not going to be look like blood. It looks more like kind of a opaque, kind of clear opaque material or substance. So, but that fluid in there, it's going to lubricate, kind of provide like a lubrication on that articular cartilage. So that will help whenever movement happens, those bones can, move against each other with no friction, because it'll lubricate them. And then so we'll have the synovial fluid in here just kind of bathing the articular cartilage, keeping it nice and kind of smooth and wet, so that way it's lubricated. So when we have movement, again, not very much friction. And then something that we have to recall is that articular cartilage, we talked about this when we talked about the skeletal system, any cartilage in the body, it doesn't contain blood vessels, and it doesn't contain nerves, like sensory nerves or anything. So because it doesn't contain blood vessels, then the only way that the cartilage can receive its nutrients is from adjacent areas. So the synovial fluid is going to have nutrients and oxygen that the cartilage needs. So those cells, the chondrocytes or the cells of the cartilage, they're going to need that. So whenever we have compression on our joints and we move our joints, the little articular cartilage kind of sucks up like a sponge some of that synovial fluid, and then that's how it gets the nutrients and the oxygen from the synovial fluid. And then any waste products that the chondrocytes have will get out of the cells and then go back into the synovial fluid. Remember, the synovial fluid keeps getting replenished, so all those waste products can be taken away in that way. So, And then the last thing that the synovial fluid does, it serves as a shock absorber. So it kind of evenly distributes any sort of pressure or stress or force across that joint too. So, all right, in the next video, we'll talk more about the synovial joints.